Pack up your smoker, your kayaks, and whatever else you've dragged out here. You have 72 hours to comply, or this goes to county enforcement." She said it loud enough for the neighbors on the dock to hear. I didn't move. Vanessa Whitmore stood on my porch like she owned it, clipboard in hand, hair perfect, smile the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. Behind her, 2 HOA board members hovered near the steps, like backup she'd brought in case I made a scene. I looked at the clipboard, then at her, then back at the lake. "Is that all?" I asked. The smile flickered, just for a second. She hadn't expected that. Nobody ever just stands there when Vanessa Whitmore shows up with a clipboard and witnesses. "Mr. Cole." Her voice dropped half a register, the tone people use when they want you to understand they are done being polite. "This isn't a conversation. This is a notice. 72 hours. I picked up my coffee from the railing, took a sip. "I heard you," I said. She turned and walked back down the steps, heels clicking on cedar that my father had cut, planed, and laid himself in 1978. The 2 board members followed without making eye contact. I watched them go. The thing about people who carry clipboards like weapons, they assume the other person has nothing to carry back. Vanessa Whitmore had spent 30 seconds on my porch issuing ultimatums to a man she'd never once thought to look up. That was the only mistake she needed to make. What's more dangerous, real power or the confidence of someone who has no idea who they're threatening? My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 49 years old, and until 8 months ago, I was a senior civil engineer at an infrastructure consulting firm in Charlotte. The kind of job where you spend your days reviewing load-bearing calculations, drainage easements, and right-of-way documentation that most people never think about until something goes wrong. I didn't burn out. I didn't get fired. I left because my father died in April, and when I drove up to Lake Mercer to sort through his things, I sat on this porch for 3 hours and realized I hadn't heard silence in 11 years. So I stayed. The house is cedar and stone, built in 1978 by a man who didn't hire contractors because he didn't trust anyone else to do it right. Single story, deep eaves, a covered porch that wraps the front and west side. The dock stretches 40 feet into the lake. Original planking, replaced twice. Same layout my father drew on graph paper the summer before I was born. There's a wood smoke smell baked into the walls that no amount of airing out will ever fully remove, and I have stopped trying. To anyone driving through Pine Hollow Cove, the house looks like the one thing that doesn't belong. The neighborhood has evolved around it over 4 decades. Gated entries, landscaped shorelines, coordinated stone facades, boat lifts that cost more than some people's cars. My father's place sits at the north end of the cove, like a reminder that this land had a life before the HOA design committee existed. I knew that coming in. I didn't mind. What I hadn't expected was Vanessa. She arrived 6 days after I moved in, before I'd even finished unpacking the kitchen, with a welcome packet and a practiced warmth that I recognized immediately as the kind people develop when they spend years delivering bad news in pleasant tones. Real estate agents, adjusters, compliance officers, people whose job is to make you feel like the problem is yours before they've finished their opening sentence. I let her talk. I always let people finish. She covered paint standards, dock clearance requirements, landscaping visibility rules, exterior lighting specifications. Then she handed over the packet and said with that same fixed smile that the board was happy to work with new residents who showed a willingness to integrate. Integrate. I remember turning the word over quietly as she walked back to her car. The house had been in my family since before most of the current residents were born, but I was the one being asked to integrate. I set the packet on the kitchen table next to my father's old survey maps and didn't open it again for 3 days. Not because I was avoiding it, because I already knew what was in it, and what wasn't. My father had a saying he repeated so often it stopped sounding like wisdom and started sounding like weather, just something that was always there. The man who announces his weight doesn't lift more. He just talks more. He meant it about engineers who spent more time in meetings than on site, but I carried it into everything, into the way I wrote reports, into the way I handled disputes with contractors, into the way I'd built, quietly, methodically, over the better part of a decade, a real estate holding company that most people in my professional circle had never heard of, Blue Heron Holdings. It wasn't a secret, exactly. It was just unloud. An LLC registered in Delaware, operating through a property management firm based in Raleigh. We didn't advertise. We didn't need to. We bought what other investors overlooked: access strips, buffer parcels, irregular waterfront lots with complicated title histories that made attorneys nervous and bargain hunters walk away. The kind of land that doesn't look like much until you understand what it controls. I had learned over many years that the most valuable thing you can own is often the thing nobody thinks to check. That philosophy extended to how I handled conflict. I don't threaten. I don't announce. I don't walk into a room and establish dominance through volume or credential. When I was still consulting, younger engineers would sometimes ask me how to handle a difficult client, someone who came in loud, dismissive, certain they were the smartest person present. I always told them the same thing. Let them finish. Let them go further than they meant to. People who underestimate you are doing you a favor. They're showing you exactly where their blind spots are. It wasn't passivity. It was patience with a purpose. The distinction matters. Passivity is what happens when you have no options. Patience is what happens when you have more options than the other person knows about, and you're waiting for the right moment to use exactly one of them. Vanessa Whitmore had knocked on my door 6 days into my arrival with a 47-point compliance document and the quiet assumption that I was a man out of his depth, someone who'd inherited a problem property and didn't have the resources, the knowledge, or the standing to push back effectively. She wasn't entirely wrong about the standing part, not yet. What she was wrong about was the assumption that standing was all I had. I don't believe in using leverage before it's necessary. I don't believe in announcing what you know before the other person has finished showing you what they don't. And I don't believe in correcting someone's misread of you the moment it happens, not when waiting costs you nothing and teaches you everything. So I waited. I unpacked. I fixed the screen door my father had been meaning to replace for 2 years. I made coffee in the mornings and watched the light come off the lake and let Vanessa Whitmore believe whatever she had already decided about the man in the old cedar house at the north end of the cove. She had no idea that decision was the most expensive one she would ever make. Have you ever chosen silence? Not because you had nothing to say, but because you were waiting for exactly the right moment to say everything. The complaints started in week 3. First was the smoker. An HOA citation claiming my offset barrel smoker, the one my father had welded himself from a repurposed propane tank, the one that had been sitting in the same spot for 19 years, was positioned too close to the water line and violated a community fire safety ordinance adopted in 2019. 41 years after my father built it, 26 years after the HOA itself was founded. I read the citation. Filed it. Then came the kayak notice. Apparently storing 2 kayaks on the north side of my dock, on my property, on my dock, created what the HOA called an unacceptable visual intrusion into shared community sightlines. I looked up that phrase in the actual HOA governing documents. It didn't exist. Someone had written it fresh for my benefit. I photographed the notice. Filed it next to the first one. The third complaint was the one that drew blood. An anonymous report filed directly with the county health department alleged that my septic system was leaking effluent into Lake Mercer. The report was detailed: coordinates, dates, descriptions of discoloration near the shoreline. Whoever filed it had done their homework, or at least done enough to make it look credible on paper. The county sent an inspector within 4 days. He was thorough, professional, and visibly uncomfortable by the end of the inspection, not because he'd found anything, but because he clearly understood what kind of inspection this was. He cleared me in 20 minutes, signed off on the system as fully compliant, no deficiencies, no further action required. But the inspection had been logged. The complaint was now part of the county's public record, and in a neighborhood where property values were built as much on perception as on square footage, a logged septic complaint, even a cleared one, was the kind of thing that followed a property. That was the point. Vanessa didn't need to win any of these skirmishes. She just needed them to accumulate. Enough citations, enough county filings, enough noise in the public record, and my father's house would start to look like a liability. To future buyers, to insurers, to anyone who ran a title search and found a property with a history of disputes and complaints. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the 14th of next month. I had 31 days. 31 days before Vanessa stood in front of the entire community and made whatever move she'd been building towards since the moment I didn't react the way she expected on that first afternoon. I needed to be ready before she got there. It was a Tuesday morning when Marcus Webb knocked on my door. Marcus lived 3 houses down, a retired high school principal, early 70s, the kind of man who still wore collared shirts to check his mailbox. He'd introduced himself my second week there with a jar of his wife's blueberry preserves and an apology that he couldn't stay to talk. I'd liked him immediately. He stood on my porch now with his hands in his jacket pockets and the look of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say and still wasn't sure he should say it. "I want you to know," he started, "that the septic complaint wasn't unanimous. Some of us thought it went too far." "I appreciate that," I said. He nodded slowly, watching me. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "You're not going to fight it, are you? The citations, the complaints." He said it less like a question and more like a man reading a situation he couldn't quite place. Most people, by now, they'd have shown up at Vanessa's door or hired someone to. You haven't done either. I poured him a coffee without asking, set it on the railing. "No," I said, "I haven't." He wrapped both hands around the mug, looked out at the lake. "She thinks you don't know how to fight back." "I know." Another pause, longer this time. "Do you?" he asked, and there was something careful in the way he said it, not challenging, more like a man who had just noticed a detail that didn't fit the picture he'd been given and wasn't sure what to do with it. I smiled, just slightly. "Marcus," I said, "do you know when this cove was first surveyed?" He blinked. No, before my time." 1974, I said. "The original parcel map divided the shoreline into 11 segments. Most of them were consolidated into larger lots through the 80s and 90s. A few weren't." I took a sip of my coffee. "The ones that weren't are interesting." He stared at me for a moment. Then he looked down at his mug, then back up. "Who are you?" he asked, not rudely, genuinely. "Retired engineer," I said. "Inherited my dad's house." He held my gaze for 2 or 3 seconds longer than felt casual. Then he picked up his coffee, nodded once, and said he'd better get back before his wife sent out a search party. I watched him walk down the path toward the road. He stopped once, about halfway, and turned back to look at the house. Not at me, at the house itself. The roof line, the lot lines, the way the property sat relative to the shoreline, the look of a man who had just started asking a question he didn't yet have the words for. Good. Someone in this neighborhood needed to start asking the right questions, because in 30 days, the answers were going to matter to every single person who lived here, whether they knew it yet or not. Have you ever watched someone realize mid-conversation that the person in front of them is not who they assumed, and seen the exact moment the certainty left their face? 3 days after Marcus's visit, I drove to the Carteret County Register of Deeds office and spent 4 hours at a public records terminal. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked why I was there. I was a member of the public, accessing public records, exactly what the system was designed for. I signed in, took a terminal in the back corner, and started pulling documents the way I'd been trained to 25 years ago, methodically, in sequence, without skipping steps because something looked obvious. Title histories, deed transfers, plat maps filed between 1974 and 1991. Easement recordings, or more precisely, the absence of them. By the time I drove home, I had a folder thick enough to confirm what I'd already suspected since the night I first sat down with my father's old survey maps at the kitchen table. The HOA's community dock, the kayak storage racks, the lakeside walking trail that curved along the north end of the cove and that every resident used without a second thought every single morning. All of it sat on land that Blue Heron Holdings had acquired in a parcel purchase 7 years ago, before I ever inherited this house, before I ever set foot in Pine Hollow Cove as a resident. A narrow strip of shoreline, irregular in shape, easy to overlook on a standard property map. The kind of parcel that title searchers sometimes missed if they weren't looking for it specifically. The HOA had been operating on the assumption that an old, informal agreement with my father, a handshake, never recorded, never formalized, was sufficient legal protection. It wasn't. There was no easement on file, no long-term lease, no recorded use agreement of any kind. Legally, they had been using my company's land for years without authorization. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I did anything with it. Not because I was calculating, because I needed to be sure of my own intentions before I moved. I could have called Vanessa that same evening, could have faxed a formal notice to the HOA's registered attorney, could have had a cease and desist on the community dock within the week. Legally, I had every right. The paperwork was clean, the title was unambiguous, but I kept coming back to one question. What do I actually want here? I didn't want to tear down a dock that 20 families used every day. I didn't want to punish an entire neighborhood for the behavior of one person. I didn't want to be the kind of man who uses legitimate power as a first move rather than a last resort. My father had never been that man. He'd lived on this lake for 40 years without once making an enemy he didn't have to make. I wanted to give the process a chance to work correctly first, so I filed the documents in a manila folder, labeled it in my father's old label maker, the one still sitting on the shelf above his desk, and put it in the top drawer. Then I waited to see whether Vanessa Whitmore would give me a reason to open it. She didn't disappoint. The 14th was 3 weeks out when Vanessa made her next move. She called a preliminary board meeting, not the annual one, a smaller session, residents only, invitation by email, to discuss what she termed ongoing property standard concerns affecting community market value. The email didn't name me. It didn't need to. Marcus forwarded it to me that same evening with a single line below. Thought you should see this. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the kitchen table and looked out at the lake for a while. The question I kept returning to wasn't whether I had the means to stop her. I did. One letter from Blue Heron Holdings' registered attorney to the HOA's legal counsel and the entire conversation would shift overnight. Vanessa would go from offense to defense so fast she wouldn't have time to reconstruct her footing. The question was, what does moving too early cost me? If I revealed the land ownership now, before the annual meeting, the board would quietly course correct. Vanessa would walk it back. She'd frame it as a misunderstanding, smooth it over with the kind of practiced diplomacy she'd clearly spent years developing, and the neighbors would never fully understand what she'd actually attempted. She'd keep her position, keep her credibility, keep doing this to the next person who moved in without the right paperwork, and the person after that. Waiting was not without cost. Every week I stayed silent. The public record accumulated another citation, another complaint, another data point that a future title search might surface. I was absorbing damage in real time. But the damage was manageable, and the alternative, a quiet resolution that left Vanessa Whitmore's behavior completely invisible to the community she claimed to serve, felt like the wrong kind of ending. Some corrections need to happen in private. This one needed witnesses, so I kept the folder in the drawer, kept my mornings on the porch, kept responding to each new HOA notice with the same 2-sentence reply. I have reviewed your citation. I do not believe it is legally applicable to my property. 11 words, every time. I wondered how many more she'd send before the 14th. 2 weeks before the annual meeting, I started building the file. Not because I was angry, Because I was ready. I pulled every citation Vanessa had issued since my arrival and cross-referenced each one against the HOA's own governing documents. The original CC&Rs filed with the county in 1986, the amended bylaws from 2004, and the supplemental design standards adopted in 2017. I flagged every instance where the cited regulation either didn't exist in the recorded documents, postdated my property's established use, or applied exclusively to lots incorporated after the HOA's founding, which mine was not. There were 9 citations total. 7 were legally inapplicable to my property on their face. The remaining 2 were borderline, the kind a competent HOA attorney would have flagged before they were ever issued, had anyone bothered to check the pre-HOA exemption language in the original deed covenants. I documented all of it, printed clean copies, organized them chronologically with tabs. Then I moved to the land records. I requested a certified copy of the Blue Heron Holdings title report for the shoreline parcel from our property management firm in Raleigh. They had it to me within 48 hours. Full chain of title going back to the 1974 original survey, the 2017 purchase agreement, the recorded deed, and the current tax parcel identification number. I set it next to the county plat map I'd pulled at the Register of Deeds office and confirmed one more time what I already knew. The community dock, the kayak racks, approximately 60 linear feet of the lakeside walking trail at the north end of the cove, all of it on Blue Heron land. I called our firm's attorney, a property law specialist named Claire Odom, who had handled every Blue Heron acquisition for the past 6 years, and walked her through the situation. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "You've been sitting on this for how long?" she asked. "Long enough," I said. "Ethan," her voice had the particular flatness of a lawyer who has just realized her client has been playing a very patient game. "What exactly do you want to happen at this meeting?" "I want the board to understand what they almost voted for," I said, "before they vote for it." Another pause. "All right," she said. "I'll have everything ready. You'll have 2 certified copies by the 12th. I thanked her and hung up. Outside, the lake was flat and silver in the late afternoon light. 40 feet from where I stood, my father's dock stretched out over water that had been in our family's life longer than the entire neighborhood surrounding it. 12 days. The preliminary board meeting happened on a Wednesday evening. I wasn't invited. I went anyway. The clubhouse was a converted boathouse at the south end of the cove, cedar shingles, new roof, HOA logo etched into a stone plaque by the entrance. About 20 residents had shown up, which was more than I'd expected for a midweek session with less than 48 hours' notice. Word had traveled. I took a seat near the back. Nobody asked me to leave. A few people looked at me the way you look at something that isn't supposed to be in a particular room, but that you're not entirely sure you have the authority to remove. Vanessa opened the meeting with a summary of what she called unresolved compliance issues creating friction within the community standard framework. Every sentence was structured to sound administrative rather than personal, but the content was exclusively about my property, the smoker, the kayaks, the septic complaint, which she mentioned without noting that it had been fully cleared by the county inspector. That omission was deliberate. I wrote it down. Then she opened the floor. 3 residents spoke in favor of stronger enforcement. 2 of them I recognized as board members. The third was a woman named Diane who lived directly across the cove from my property and who, I had been told, was currently listing her home with Vanessa's real estate firm. Then a man near the front, someone I didn't recognize, raised his hand and asked directly, "Has anyone actually reviewed whether the Cole property is subject to these regulations, given when it was built?" The room shifted slightly, just slightly. Vanessa smiled. "The board's position is that all properties within the geographic boundaries of Pine Hollow Cove are subject to community standards, regardless of construction date." That was not what the CC&Rs said, not even close. I didn't correct her. I wrote that down too. After the meeting, walking back along the lake path in the dark, I passed the community dock, stood at the edge of it for a moment, looked down at the water, looked back at the HOA logo on the boathouse wall. Then I walked home and added 3 more pages to the file. Is there anything more telling than what a person chooses to leave out when they're the one controlling the room? She came back 4 days before the annual meeting. This time she didn't knock. She rang the bell twice, rapidly, the way someone does when they want you to understand that their time is more valuable than your comfort. When I opened the door, she was already talking. "Mr. Cole, I want to be direct with you." She had a different folder this time, thinner, darker cover, the kind used for formal correspondence rather than welcome packets. "The board has retained outside counsel to review the compliance situation. We believe we have sufficient grounds to pursue enforcement action through the county and potentially civil remedies for ongoing property standard violations." I leaned against the doorframe. "That's your right," I said. Something moved behind her eyes. She'd expected resistance or capitulation or confusion. She hadn't expected agreement delivered in 3 words with no affect whatsoever. She pressed forward. "I want you to understand something." Her voice dropped into that register again, the one she used when she wanted words to feel like walls. "I have been doing this for 16 years. I have managed 14 HOA communities across 3 counties. I have seen people in your exact situation. People who inherit properties they don't fully understand, in communities they don't fully belong to. And I can tell you that fighting this process never ends well for them. People who don't fully belong." I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. Let it exist exactly as she'd said it. "I want to make sure I understand you correctly," I said quietly. "Are you telling me I don't belong here?" She recalibrated, smoothly, professionally, the way someone does when they realize a phrase landed harder than intended. "I'm saying that integration into an established community requires a certain willingness to—" "You used that word before," I said. "Integrate." The smile held, but her grip on the folder tightened. "The meeting is Thursday," she said. "The board will be presenting a formal motion. I strongly recommend you consider your options before then, including the option of reaching a private resolution that doesn't require any of this to become part of the public record." She was offering me a quiet exit. Leave without a fight. Sell. Disappear. Let Pine Hollow Cove return to the clean, coordinated, brochure-ready image she'd spent years building. I looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you for coming by," I said, and I closed the door. Behind me, on the kitchen shelf, my father's old label maker sat next to a manila folder with 4 certified documents inside it. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. The HOA's outside counsel was a firm called Bridger and Associates out of Wilmington. I looked them up the same evening Vanessa left my porch. Mid-size practice, heavy on residential real estate and community association law. They had a decent track record with HOA enforcement cases, mostly against individual homeowners who didn't have legal representation and didn't understand that an HOA's authority, while real, was also bounded by documents that most residents never actually read. They were good at what they did. They were also about to walk into a situation they hadn't been fully briefed on. I knew this because 2 days before the annual meeting, I received a formal letter on Bridger and Associates letterhead. It cited 4 specific HOA regulations, referenced the county complaint history, and informed me that the board intended to seek injunctive relief compelling compliance, along with reimbursement of legal fees incurred in the enforcement process. The letter was competent. It was also built entirely on the assumption that my property was subject to HOA jurisdiction without qualification, an assumption that collapsed the moment anyone looked at the pre-HOA exemption language in the original 1986 CC&Rs. I forwarded it to Claire Odom that same afternoon. Her reply came back in under 2 hours. "They didn't do a title search. Call me." I called her. "They pulled the complaint history and the citation log," she said, "but nobody ran a full title chain on your parcel. If they had, they would have found the pre-HOA construction date, the exemption covenant, and—" She paused, and I could hear the particular satisfaction of a property attorney who has just spotted something the other side missed entirely. "They definitely would have found Blue Heron." "Would that have changed their advice to the board?" I asked. Ethan, if Vanessa Whitmore's attorney had found Blue Heron Holdings in that title chain, he would have called her within the hour and told her to drop every single citation, issue a written apology, and hope you weren't in a litigious mood. A beat. Instead, they sent you a demand letter. I asked her to prepare a response, not aggressive, not threatening, a clean, factual letter acknowledging receipt of the Bridger and Associates correspondence and noting that I would be presenting relevant property documentation at the annual meeting for the board's review prior to any vote. Professional, measured, the kind of letter that only reads as a warning in retrospect. She had it ready the next morning. I sent it certified mail and kept the receipt. Meanwhile, Vanessa had clearly interpreted my silence over the preceding weeks as confirmation that I was exactly what she'd decided I was, a man without resources, without recourse, without the sophistication to mount any meaningful defense. In the 48 hours before the annual meeting, she sent 2 more HOA notices, both citing new violations. One was for a wind chime my father had hung from the porch eave in 1994. The other was for the color of my front door. The front door my father had painted himself the summer I turned 12, the same July afternoon he taught me how to read a property survey. Navy blue, the exact shade he'd chosen because, he said, it looked like the lake on a clear morning. I did not change it. I did, however, add both notices to the file, which was now, by my count, 43 pages long. The evening before the annual meeting, Marcus Webb appeared at my door again. No blueberry preserves this time, just the man himself, hands in his jacket pockets, standing in the yellow porch light with the particular expression of someone who has been thinking about something for 3 weeks and has finally decided to say it out loud. I opened the screen door. He came in without being asked, the first time he'd done that. He sat at the kitchen table, looked at the manila folder sitting next to my father's label maker, looked at the survey map I'd left unfolded on the counter, didn't say anything about either. I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. I did some digging, he said finally. Into what? He wrapped his hands around the mug. The North Shore parcel, the one the dock sits on. He said it carefully, the way a man says something when he's not entirely sure he should know it. I used to be on the Architectural Review Committee back in 2014. We had a title question come up on a different lot, access strip issue, and I learned how to read the county parcel maps. He paused. So I looked. I waited. The HOA doesn't own that land, he said. Does it? It wasn't quite a question. No, I said, it doesn't. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the lake made the small sounds it made at night. Water against the dock pilings, something moving in the reeds of the north end of the cove. How long have you known? He asked. Since before I moved in, I said. He looked at me steadily, processing, recalibrating, the same way he'd done on my porch 3 weeks ago when I'd mentioned the 1974 survey, but more completely this time, like a picture that had been slightly out of focus, suddenly sharpening into something clear. You're not just a retired engineer, he said. I am absolutely a retired engineer, I said. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. Ethan, he set down his mug. Whatever you're planning for tomorrow, I want you to know that there are people in that room who are tired of being told what this neighborhood is supposed to look like by someone who profits from making it that way. He stood, buttoned his jacket. You won't be standing up alone. He left without finishing his coffee. I sat at the table for a while after he'd gone, in the quiet of my father's kitchen, and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsteady for weeks. Sometimes, the most important thing someone can offer isn't help. It's simply the willingness to stand in the same room and let the truth be true. Thursday morning arrived cold and flat, the kind of November morning where the lake holds the mist until almost 10 and the cedar smell in the house is strongest because the air outside has nowhere to go. I woke at 5:30, made coffee, sat on the porch in a jacket, and watched the water the way my father used to, not looking for anything in particular, just being present in a place that had held his life for 4 decades and was now, quietly, holding mine. I thought about what Vanessa had said on my porch 4 days ago. People who inherit properties they don't fully understand, in communities they don't fully belong to. I thought about the septic complaint, logged in the county system forever regardless of the cleared inspection, about the wind chime citation, about the color of my front door, about 11 citations issued over 8 weeks for a property that predated the HOA's authority by nearly 40 years. And I thought about the motion Vanessa was planning to put before the board tonight. Claire had called yesterday afternoon with an update. Through her contacts in the county's legal community, she'd learned that Bridger and Associates had prepared formal documentation for injunctive relief, a court filing that, if approved, would compel me to either bring the property into HOA compliance within 60 days or face daily financial penalties. The filing was ready. Vanessa intended to use tonight's vote as the board's formal authorization to proceed. If that vote passed, the legal process would begin before the week was out. Injunctive relief, even when ultimately defeated, takes time and money to fight. It generates court records. It clouds title. It is precisely the kind of sustained institutional pressure designed to make an individual conclude that the cost of staying is higher than the cost of leaving. Which was, I understood now with complete clarity, exactly what Vanessa had been building toward since the morning she handed me that welcome packet. Not compliance, departure. She wanted the house, or rather, she wanted the lot. The north end parcel with its original cedar structure replaced by something that matched the neighborhood's current aesthetic and added the right kind of value to the surrounding properties. Properties that, in several cases, she was currently listing or had recently sold. I went inside and retrieved the manila folder from the kitchen drawer, set it on the table, opened it, and went through each document one final time. Not because I needed to, but because precision matters, and I had learned a long time ago never to walk into a consequential room without having touched every piece of paper you intend to use. Survey, title report, deed history, certified parcel map. 4 documents, 43 supporting pages. Enough. I showered, dressed, and ate a bowl of oatmeal standing at the counter looking out at the lake. The mist had started to lift. The water was beginning to show its color, that particular deep blue-gray of Lake Mercer in November, the same color as my front door, the same color my father had chosen because it looked like the lake on a clear morning. Tonight, I was going to make sure this was a very clear morning. The annual meeting started at 7. By 6:50, the clubhouse was fuller than I'd expected. 43 residents, by my count, more than double the preliminary session 2 weeks ago. Word had traveled further than Vanessa had probably intended. People who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years were pulling folding chairs from the stack against the back wall. I sat in the 3rd row, folder on my lap, jacket on. Coffee I'd brought in a thermos because the clubhouse coffee was, by universal agreement among residents, undrinkable. Vanessa was at the front, arranging materials at the presenter's table with the focused energy of someone who had rehearsed this evening multiple times and was confident in the outcome. She'd brought a projector, a laptop, printed handouts stacked in neat piles at the end of each row, which 2 board members were distributing as people settled in. I took a handout when it reached me. It was titled, Protecting Pine Hollow Cove, Community Standards and Property Value Preservation, A Path Forward. 12 pages, color printed, professionally designed. There was a pie chart showing HOA compliance rates by property zone and a bar graph labeled Estimated Impact of Non-Conforming Properties on Adjacent Market Values. The data sources were not cited. On page 7, there was an aerial photograph of the north end of the cove. My father's house was circled in a thin red line. The caption read, Legacy Non-Conforming Property, Ongoing Compliance Concern. Legacy Non-Conforming Property. I looked at the photograph for a moment. The cedar roof line, the dock extending 40 feet into the water, the kayaks on the north side, the smoker my father had welded from a propane tank in 1987. Then I turned the handout face down on my knee and looked toward the front of the room. That was when I noticed the man seated at the far end of the board table whom I didn't recognize. Middle 50s, dark suit, leather portfolio open in front of him. Not a resident. He had the particular stillness of someone present in a professional capacity rather than a personal one. Bridger and Associates. Had to be. Marcus was seated 2 rows behind me. When I glanced back, he gave me a single nod, the kind that means, I see it too. Then something else caught my attention. A woman near the side wall, early 40s, reading the handout carefully, stopped on page 7, looked at the aerial photograph, then looked toward the back of the room where the community dock was visible through the clubhouse's rear windows, lit by the path lights along the lakeside trail. She looked back at the photograph. Then she leaned toward the man seated next to her and said something quietly. He looked at the photograph too, then at the window, then at the photograph again. They were doing the math. Looking at the aerial image, at the property lines, at the position of the dock relative to the circled lot. They hadn't reached the answer yet, but they were asking the question, which meant the room was closer to ready than Vanessa knew. I set my thermos on the floor, straightened the folder on my lap, and waited for her to begin. Have you ever watched a room full of people standing on the edge of a truth, close enough to feel it, but not yet close enough to see it? Vanessa opened the meeting at 7:03. She was good. I'll give her that. 16 years of HOA management had given her a particular fluency, the ability to make procedural maneuvering sound like community stewardship, to frame personal agendas as collective responsibility, to deliver what amounted to an attack in the language of care. She opened with property values, 3 slides showing Lake Mercer area appreciation trends over the past decade, with Pine Hollow Cove outperforming comparable lakefront communities by 14%. She credited HOA enforcement standards. The room responded with the quiet satisfaction of people hearing that their investments were sound. Then she moved to compliance challenges. The slides changed. The aerial photograph from the handout appeared on the projector. My father's house, red circle, caption intact. She didn't use my name. She said, the North End property, with the careful neutrality of someone who has been advised by counsel to depersonalize the target. She outlined the citation history, 11 notices, the county septic complaint, mentioned without the cleared inspection result, exactly as she'd done at the preliminary meeting, the retained outside counsel, the prepared injunctive filing. Then she said, the board is asking tonight for authorization to proceed with formal legal enforcement. This is not a decision we've reached lightly, but protecting the standards that protect all of your investments requires us to act when informal resolution has failed. She looked directly at me when she said, informal resolution has failed. The room stirred, not hostility, something more uncomfortable than that. The collective unease of people being asked to endorse something that felt slightly larger than a compliance dispute, but that they couldn't quite name. Then the attorney from Bridger and Associates spoke. He introduced himself as counsel retained by the board. He was measured, authoritative, and efficient. 3 minutes that laid out the legal framework for HOA enforcement authority in North Carolina, the grounds for injunctive relief, and the board's exposure if non-conforming properties were allowed to continue without action. He was persuasive. He was also working from an incomplete file, but the room didn't know that yet. Vanessa called for preliminary comments before the vote. 2 board members spoke in support. Diane, the resident listing her home with Vanessa's firm, spoke about property values and neighborhood cohesion. A man I didn't recognize said something about precedent setting. Then Vanessa said, if there are no further comments, I'd like to move to the vote. She was looking at her laptop, not at me. The attorney had his pen ready. Marcus shifted in his seat behind me. The woman near the side wall who had been studying the aerial photograph put her hand out down slowly, like someone setting something fragile on a table. And for one long moment, 5 seconds, maybe 6, I sat in the 3rd row of that clubhouse with a folder on my lap and watched Vanessa Whitmore prepare to do exactly what she had been building toward for 8 weeks. The vote was going to pass. She had the board. She had the attorney. She had the room's anxiety about property values working in her favor. In 6 seconds, if I didn't stand up, it would be done. I picked up the folder, and I stood up. Every head in the room turned. Vanessa looked up from her laptop. The attorney set down his pen. The board members exchanged glances with the particular discomfort of people who have just realized the script may be about to change. Mr. Cole, Vanessa's voice was careful, controlled. The comment period has closed. We're moving to the vote. I understand, I said. I'm asking the board for 2 minutes before that vote to review one document. The room was very quiet. I wasn't loud. I wasn't angry. I was standing in the third row of a converted boathouse on a November evening holding a manila folder, and I was aware, with the particular clarity that comes from having waited a long time for a specific moment, that everything my father had built, everything he had left me, and everything this house represented was sitting in the next 60 seconds. My father had been 63 when he died. He'd lived in that house for 44 years. He'd raised me in it, fixed it with his own hands, watched the neighborhood change around it, and never once apologized for the fact that it predated everything that had grown up beside it. He used to say that a man's home was not his castle. Castles are built to intimidate. A home, he said, is built to last. He'd built his to last. I thought about the navy blue door, the porch eave with the wind chime that had hung there since 1994, the one Vanessa had cited as a violation. The smoker he'd welded himself, the dock he'd drawn on graph paper the summer before I was born. I thought about sitting at this same kitchen table as a 12-year-old while he taught me how to read a property survey. Patient, unhurried, tracing the boundary lines with one finger and explaining what each notation meant and why it mattered. The map doesn't lie, he'd said. People lie. Documents lie sometimes, but the land is what it is. Learn to read what it actually says. I had spent 37 years learning to read what things actually said, and what the documents in my folder said, what they had been saying quietly in the Carteret County Public Record for 7 years, was something that Vanessa Whitmore had never once thought to look for. I looked at the board. 2 minutes, I said again. That's all I'm asking. The board chair, not Vanessa, a quieter man named Gerald who had said almost nothing all evening, looked at Vanessa, then at me, then at the folder in my hand. Go ahead, Mr. Cole, he said. I walked to the front of the room, not quickly, not with any kind of performance, just a man walking to the front of a converted boathouse on a Thursday evening, folder under his arm, thermos left behind in the third row. Vanessa stepped slightly to the side, not fully, just enough to make the gesture feel like accommodation rather than retreat. Her expression had settled into something professionally neutral, the face of someone who has decided that whatever is about to happen, she can manage it. I set the folder on the presenter's table, opened it, removed 4 documents and arranged them in a single row, face up, in the order I intended to use them. Then I looked at the room. I want to start with the county parcel map, I said. Filed with the Carteret County Register of Deeds. Public record. Anyone can pull this tomorrow morning. I turned to Vanessa's laptop and asked, quietly, without drama, whether I could connect to the projector. She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she stepped aside. I pulled the certified plat map from the folder and held it up to the document camera the board used for presenting meeting minutes. The image appeared on the projector screen behind me. The same screen Vanessa had used for her property value slides, now showing the north end of Lake Mercer in clean survey lines and parcel notations. This is the 1974 original survey of the Pine Hollow Cove shoreline, I said. You'll see 11 parcels along the waterline. Most were consolidated through the 80s and 90s into the residential lots you currently own. I pointed to a narrow, irregular strip running along the north end. This one wasn't. The room leaned forward, slightly, collectively, the way rooms do when something on a screen stops being abstract. Parcel 7 North, approximately 0.3 acres of shoreline frontage, irregular dimensions, acquired in a private transaction in 2017. I set the plat map down and picked up the second document, the certified deed. This is the recorded deed for that parcel. Carteret County. Book 4892, page 117. You'll see the grantor, the consideration paid, and the grantee. I placed it under the document camera. The grantee field was visible on the projector screen. Blue Heron Holdings, LLC. I gave the room 4 seconds to read it. Blue Heron Holdings is my company, I said. I am its sole managing member. I have been since its founding in 2013. The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that happens when 43 people simultaneously recalibrate something they thought they understood. I picked up the third document, the title report, certified by Claire Odom's firm, showing the full chain of ownership for Parcel 7 North from 1974 to present. I placed it under the camera. This is the title report. You'll see the complete ownership history. There are no recorded easements on this parcel, no long-term lease agreements, no formal use authorizations of any kind. I paused. What there is, what has been here this entire time in the public record, available to anyone who looked, is a piece of land that your community dock, your kayak storage racks, and approximately 60 linear feet of your lakeside walking trail are all sitting on. I let that land. Vanessa had not moved. She was standing 3 feet to my left, and I was aware of her the way you are aware of something very still in your peripheral vision. The attorney from Bridger and Associates had picked up his pen again, not to write, just holding it, the unconscious gesture of a man whose professional footing has just shifted without warning. Someone in the back of the room said, "Wait." Someone else said, "The dock?" The woman near the side wall, who had been studying the aerial photograph earlier, the one who had been doing the math since before the meeting started, closed her eyes briefly. She'd gotten there first. I placed the fourth document under the camera. The certified letter from Claire Odom's firm, dated 3 days ago, confirming Blue Heron Holdings' ownership position and the absence of any recorded access agreement. I want to be clear about something, I said. And this was the part I had thought about longest. Not the reveal, not the documents, but this. I did not come here tonight to threaten this community. I came here because 8 weeks ago, a woman knocked on my door and handed me a 47-point compliance document for a house that predates this HOA's authority by nearly 40 years. Since then, I have received 11 citations, 1 fraudulent county complaint, a formal demand letter from outside counsel, and a presentation tonight that described my father's home as a— I glanced at the handout on the nearest chair. Legacy non-conforming property. I looked at Vanessa directly for the first time since I'd walked to the front. She was looking at the projector screen, at the deed, at the grantee field, at her own name. Not literally, but at the thing she had never once thought to look for, now displayed on her own projector in her own clubhouse in front of every person in the neighborhood she had spent 16 years telling how things worked. Before this board votes on removing me, I said, I think you should understand that the private dock you use every morning, the kayak racks your children grew up on, and the walking trail that every resident in this room has used without a second thought, all of it sits on land that my company owns. I closed the folder. I have no interest in tearing any of it down. I have no interest in disrupting this community. But if the harassment continues, if one more citation is issued, one more county complaint is filed, one more formal legal action is initiated against my property, I will revoke informal access to Parcel 7 North and pursue compensation for 7 years of unauthorized use. I picked up the folder. That's all I had, I said. Thank you for the 2 minutes. And I walked back to the third row, sat down, picked up my thermos. The room did not recover quickly. Gerald, the board chair, said something that didn't fully form into a sentence. The attorney from Bridger and Associates closed his leather portfolio with the careful deliberateness of a man who intended to bill for this evening and was already composing the call he needed to make to his client first thing tomorrow morning. Vanessa stood at the front of the room for a long moment, in front of her own projector, her own slides, her own carefully prepared path forward, and said nothing at all. Which was, I thought, the most honest thing she'd done since the day she knocked on my door. What does it cost a person to realize that the war they started was fought on ground they never actually owned? The vote never happened. Gerald adjourned the meeting 20 minutes after I sat back down, not with any formal resolution, just a quiet announcement that the board needed time to review new information before proceeding. The Bridger and Associates attorney was the first person out the door. Diane left without making eye contact with anyone. The printed handouts stayed on the chairs where people had set them down. Most residents lingered. Not around Vanessa, around each other, in the small clusters that form when a community has just collectively learned something that changes the way they understand where they live. I heard fragments. The doc, the whole time, she never checked. 7 years. The phrases people use when they're still assembling a picture from pieces that have just been handed to them all at once. Marcus found me by the coat rack near the entrance. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there with his jacket half on, looking at me with an expression that was equal parts vindication and something older than that. "Your father would have enjoyed tonight," he said finally. "He would have enjoyed it more quietly than I did," I said. Marcus smiled, a real one. Yes, he would have. Claire Odom called the following morning. The HOA's board had already been in contact with Bridger and Associates, who had formally withdrawn from the engagement. Gerald had reached out directly to Claire to discuss formalizing access to Parcel 7 North through a properly recorded easement agreement. Fair market terms, long-term lease, everything documented and filed with the county the way it should have been years ago. We negotiated over 3 weeks. The terms were reasonable. Blue Heron Holdings granted a 50-year easement for the dock, kayak storage, and trail access. The HOA paid a fair annual fee. Everything went into the public record, clean and permanent, the way my father had always believed property agreements should be. Vanessa Whitmore resigned from the HOA board in December. The resignation letter, which Gerald shared with residents, cited personal reasons and a desire to focus on her real estate practice. Nobody in the neighborhood publicly disputed that framing. Nobody needed to. The room full of people who had watched her stand at a projector screen and go silent when the truth appeared on it. They remembered. That kind of memory doesn't require a press release. The citations stopped. All 11 were formally voided by the board in January, with a written acknowledgement that my property's pre-HOA status had not been properly reviewed prior to issuance. I kept the manila folder, filed it in the cabinet in my father's office, next to his original survey maps and the graph paper dock drawing from the summer before I was born. On the first warm day in March, I brought the smoker out, set it in its original spot, 41 years in, 19 feet from the water line, loaded it with hickory, and let it run all afternoon. By evening, the smoke had drifted south along the cove. Marcus appeared at my dock around 5, hands in his jacket pockets, and I handed him a plate without being asked. We sat there until the light left the lake. The wind chime my father hung in 1994 moved in the small breeze off the water. Navy blue door behind us, cedar porch beneath us, 40 feet of dock extending out over a lake that had held this family's life since before this neighborhood had a name. Some things are built to last, and the people who try to unmake them, they never quite understand that the land remembers everything, even when the people standing on it don't.